So lovely. So Harish, frankly for you, no introduction can be brief, but I'm going to attempt a brief introduction. You frankly don't need an introduction, but you are pretty much the first human that beat IBM's AI debater, making sure you're standing for humanity in 2019. It resulted in a lovely movie, documentary, and a New York bestseller. Yourself having been a world champion and having excelled at 30 plus more international debates, you are also a coach and an envious coach, because this week, or rather I would say this month, Harish was also coaching the national team of Hong Kong that landed up as finalists in the World School Debating Championships. So Harish, congratulations on that. But also another side to Harish is that professionally, he's the head of economic analysis at AKE International, which is based out of London. So if you have any parents and kids still wondering what argumentative paths or debating paths lead to as a career, there's your answer for it. With that, Harish, I'm happy to hand over the session to you to hear your journey from having become a world-class debater to now a world-class coach. So over to you, Harish. Thank you so much. You're able to unmute it, Harish? So to the audience, we'd like to see more faces. It'll be lovely to see you all. Harish, are you able to unmute the mic? No?
Yes,
okay.
Now I can. Great.
Yes, perfect. So over to you, Harish.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope you've had a good Independence Day thus far. I mean, I guess it's been a challenging year for almost everyone, but hopefully it only gets better from here, but that might be a bit optimistic, but let's remain optimistic. So what I just want to talk briefly about is just to start with a bit of what I think you can do with debating, just to pick up from the last point which Anjali was making, where I think it actually intersects with the real world. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I approach coaching debating and what I think that can teach you as people who are either interested in coaching debating or interested in picking up and improving your debating skills yourself. But one thing which I think is often a misconception is that people look at debating often as a academic exercise or competitive exercise, where what you are doing is learning skills which are useful in the small subset of areas to try and convince someone of the value of your argument. And that's certainly part of what the value of debating is, but only at the very surface. Because when you look at it, and when you spend months, yet alone years doing debating, and one thing which I do believe is everyone should try it for at least 6 months to a year. If you love it, it's worth doing more of it. But the core skills are things which can last a lifetime in a whole range of different areas. And just to go through a handful of them, which I find myself to be very useful. The first one is your ability to logically construct an argument and to make that easily understandable to almost any audience. Because one of the keys of debating, at least as you do more and more of it, is you'll end up with a topic with a short amount of time to prepare. Depending on the format, that can be as little as 2 minutes, more often 15 or an hour. But a consequence of that is you don't have a huge amount of time to research all the aspects of the topic. You're not able to read about what everyone else writes or says about it. And that may in some ways be a drawback, because certainly it doesn't at that stage involve in-depth research. But the positive of it is it helps us start to realize we can construct logical arguments from what we already know. That convincing an audience isn't simply about making a statement and drawing upon a study. It's instead asking yourself, well, if there's evidence for something, there must be a logical chain of reasons why it is true. something cannot be true in the real world without it logically having a set of factors which makes it true. And I think at its best, debating is partially about knowing what the facts are, but partially going, well, why exactly is that true? We know something is true, but let's try and construct it from first principles, step by step. And that, I think, is one of the first huge values of debating. It allows us to look at facts and ask ourselves, why is that true? What's the chain of logic which is underlying it? And that's valuable in almost everything which we do. And part of it is almost irrespective of what field people go into, you'll find scientific and empirical evidence. But part of the question there is, when you compare two studies which give you the opposite results, well, how exactly do you respond to that? Well, part of it is looking at the methodology, of course, but part of it is asking logically, how do you get to these conclusions? And debating forces us to try and create these logical links carefully. And that, I think, is very powerful for everyone and augments the kinds of fact-based studying that many of us do a lot of. That's one of the first values. But the second is how you communicate that to other individuals. And I think you could be the best doctor in the world in terms of seeing a patient, knowing exactly what is wrong very quickly, or having a good idea. But that's only part of the skill. The other part of the skill is, can you communicate that to people who are not specialists in that field? Are you able to present your knowledge in a way that is useful for other people and their ability to understand it? And oddly, I think in most of what we study doesn't really give us that skill. It partially does. When you're writing an essay, you're at least partially trying to communicate, but you're still trying to communicate often with a teacher, as someone who knows the subject back to front. Well, that's a different challenge than communicating with someone who is intelligent, curious, but doesn't have a specialist understanding of a topic. And I find this to be one of the more useful things when I meet clients, in that they can ask me a question. And the reason they'll ask me a question is I'll have in-depth knowledge which they won't have. And it's not just about giving them all that knowledge, but presenting it in a way where they understand what I'm saying, what the important parts are, and structured in a way which makes it very easy for them to follow. I think that becomes the second skill involved in debating. The third one, which I want to focus a tiny bit on, is independent research. Having said that debating is often about logic, it's really useful at the same time to build your corpus of knowledge. That's partially about knowing what is happening in current affairs, but it's partly about understanding other things as well. How does an education system work? How does that differ from country to country? How does healthcare differ from country to country? And I think debating makes us a little bit more curious about these things. And you mainly approach it to begin with from a competitive aspect, which is, I want to do better in that debate about women's rights. So I'll start reading what the theory is about feminism. But that's great. It may not be something which you would have ever found that interesting independently. But you may only accumulate some of that knowledge because you want to do well in a competitive debate. But that is so powerful for the rest of our lives. And that works in so many ways. Over the years, the number of things I read, which I didn't originally think I would find interesting, has broadened my understanding extensively on a whole range of topics, many of which I don't spend a huge amount of time on now, but it certainly has made me more aware of different ways people think, different problems groups face, different solutions based on the countries, based on different kinds of countries. It is useful because you start understanding that all of our worldviews is in some degree myopic, that we focus on our own country naturally, because that's our experiences. Well, here are the ways things could be different, either different kinds of problems individuals face. And I find that to be another very powerful aspect of what you can get out of debating. And all of those are useful in a competitive setting, of course, but I think actually have huge value into the rest of our lives for the years and years to come. And even if you would ever do a year of debating, that can be very powerful in just shaping how we present ourselves, how we construct arguments, and how much we actually know, and our willingness to be open to other kinds of positions. And I start with all of that because I think it's also very useful when it comes to what kind of insights people get when you start coaching debating, and what I look at from potentially a young debater to say what you need to improve if you actually want to become very good at this activity. And I had an interesting experience of the last year with Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has some huge advantages as a potential debating circuit. It is a rich, well, what's the word here? State, mini state, a territory of China, whatever formal set of words would you use there, with people with strong English speaking abilities and a very good school system. But one thing which it lacks and still lacks is a very deep schools debating culture. But to me, in a sense, that isn't a huge problem because there's three things which I think you look for when you're trying to select a group of students. The first one of these is, do they have a passion for it? Which is, are you willing to work hard and are you willing to put the effort in? And it's different at different levels. If you're just looking at debate and get some of the core skills out of it, it probably isn't something you'll need to spend 5 hours a week on. If you want to represent your nation or your city, it simply then does become something which, just like we would train for any sport, does involve a reasonable degree of commitment. But one of the advantages there is if you are willing to work hard, it's something which almost anyone can pick up, which is, at least from my perspective, I could have spent 20 hours a day trying to play football. I would have still been terrible at it. But debating actually is something which most people will be able to do if you're willing to put the effort in. If you're willing to go, okay, let's think about what I don't know. Let's look at the speech I just gave. How would I make it better the next time? And there's two ways in which you can approach that, both of which I think are very valuable. The first one is looking at it from the perspective of a judge or a coach, someone who externally views your speech and says, here are certain things which you could improve. And that could probably go along three potential explanations. It could be your content is great, but it's not being presented clearly enough that a general member of the public or even a well-informed, unbiased individual would be able to pick up everything you're saying, or even the majority of what you're saying, which is, in a sense, just what I guess would be a style critique, which is how do you present your material in a way which is highly compelling to an audience. One of the most valuable skills we have, it's never entirely just about what we are saying, but it is that we are saying so in a way that someone else can understand. So it's the first kind of critique which someone else could give you. The second part of that would be a content critique, which is, here are your arguments. Well, let's take each of these arguments. And what we're asking is, have you been able to show that this is important in the debate and this is true in the debate? And every single argument anyone will make in any walk of life is basically going to be the same. It's going to be, for these reasons, this statement is true, and this statement is important in proving that on balance, this side of the debate, of the argument, is correct. And the third piece of critique is, sure, you made the arguments you selected, you made pretty well, you explained them well, but what are you missing? What else could you potentially have said? How could you have responded better, maybe, to the arguments another team made? And one thing which I've learned over the years is, you can give a speech you're incredibly happy with, which you think is one of the better speeches you've given. That doesn't mean that you can't do it better. And I think it's always just striving and asking yourself, which is, you could be satisfied with what you've done, but if you really want to excel, the question is, no matter how well you've done, no matter whether you won that debate or lost it, what would you do differently the next time? Or what questions would you now ask yourself? And now you have however many days to think about them to do it better. And I think when you're coaching, you're asking these questions and trying to answer these questions. How do you present your arguments better? of the arguments you made? How do you make them more compelling? Or what gaps are there in the arguments you made? And what else could you have said? And if you look at it that way, in a sense, it's not that difficult to improve because you're asking the same questions constantly and you keep seeing yourself improving over time. But that's from a coaching perspective. And while that could be very valuable, coaches are always, or judges, are always going to be very limited in the amount of time that they're going to be able to spend with you. And they can push you around the right path. But for most of you, and most people in general, sometimes the most important thing is to be self-critical, to ask yourself those questions. It can be great if you've recorded a debate beforehand, one which you spoke in, and then you can see yourself and go, actually, was that as clear as it could have been? How else could I have said it? What other arguments could I have made? But I find these two processes work very well together, that what you can do from a coaching perspective is go, okay, I've seen you in 4 debates. This, and this are what you need to work on. But you're going to see yourself in however many more than I ever will. And now I've given you an idea of what you need to work on. Well, look at your own speeches. How would you improve them in future? And I think this is probably a more general lesson about how you improve in anything. And it's partly there's going to be other individuals telling you, here are things which you could do better. And as long as I think we have the same project, we both want to make you better as a speaker, a better thinker, more knowledgeable about the world, I think that could work quite well. But it is always also about you looking at yourself and going, what would I have done differently? And how would I have done it differently in future? And that is going to be true irrespective of how good you were in individual debate. One final point to make on that. Often I think we struggle with the idea of recording ourselves and watching ourselves speak. And I think this is, even when you don't feel self-conscious, when you just talk on a camera, often watching yourself afterwards does make everyone feel self-conscious, because then you really do start picking up on the things which you did wrong. But one thing which is really powerful to me is if any of you were to give a speech right now, and then 6 months from now, rewatch it, you would almost certainly cringe at what you did. You'd go like, oh, how did I give a speech like that? There were all the errors I made. But actually what that's telling you is how much you've improved over the space of those 6 months. And that's one of the great things to me about many walks of life. I think debating actually helps a great deal in it, which is, it's not just the skills, the competitive aspect I find to be very valuable here, because it gives us constant metrics. Now, these metrics are imperfect, like maybe you win one debate, maybe you don't, but certainly over a period of time, it says, am I improving? Am I doing better as a speaker than I was before? Is my team doing better than it was before? Am I making better arguments than I am before? Some of that is going to be external metrics. It's how well do you do in small competitions, large competitions, etc. Some of it's just going to be you looking at your speech now and looking at the speech which you gave in 6 months. And you'll be able to spot very quickly the progress which you have made. I think the competitive aspect really helps, because I think we often struggle a little bit with this, which is, you can sometimes tell you become slightly better at things, but on a week-to-week basis, often that change is very small. That I become a tiny bit better from one week to the next, but really I can't perceive it. Over 3 months, it probably becomes noticeable, but I can't remember how I was and what I was speaking like 3 months ago, or how good I was 3 months ago, yet alone 6 months ago. And that's why I often think that recording yourself and using these external metrics can help us get perspective, which is, you will get better every few debates you do, not necessarily one debate to another, but every few weeks. You won't necessarily notice that you get better. And indeed, often better you get, higher your standards become. And you may not even think you're improving at all. But one of the things which is very notable is you are. And this is one of the things which happened to me when I came to coaching Hong Kong, which is, as a result of a partial lack of experience in the circuit, 2 of the people on the final team had less than a year's experience. So they would have attended their first tournament about almost exactly a year ago from now. And one of the most incredible things is actually watching them progress. And you note fairly early in the process, we try to select a team which you think has potential. And these kids are working really hard. They're picking things up very hard, very well. And then you look at them at a tournament they would have spoken at in January, then one in March. So only less than 6 months ago. And then looking at what they were doing 2 weeks ago. And it becomes so incredible to watch. But in fact, if you'd ask them, how much have you improved? They would have probably over the space of 9 months been able to say, we've improved quite a lot. But ask them from January to March if they've improved, they're like, maybe a tiny bit. But then watch the videos and watch the results. And I think it's one of the most useful things in the competitive process, that you're pushed to do that you see the external metrics, and then you start realizing how much you are improving, even though you haven't been able to notice it yourself. And those were a couple of things which I picked up about coaching. Now, for all of you and people who want to do a lot of debating, I think there's a couple of things which you can do when it comes to just trying to improve yourself. I mean, obviously, some level of coaching, some of competition is very valuable. But here, I guess, would be 3 other things beyond what I've already said, which I think will be useful. The first one of these is read widely, but don't think of yourself as reading because you want to be good at debating. Because in the end, debating is talking about almost anything which could happen in the world, sometimes theoretical, sometimes real. But if all you're doing is going to read for debating, which maybe sometimes you will do, but it's often just reading because you find something interesting. When you get a topic you don't know a huge amount about, it's not just that you want to think next time you walk into the room you know more about it. It's, well, what don't I know? And then you read a bit about it, see what you find more interesting, and keep reading. And very quickly you'll realize you went from knowing little bits or even a lot about a few things to knowing a reasonable amount about many, many things. And I think helps us a great deal, not just when it comes to a debate, but when it comes to all aspects of our lives. The idea that we have the time, for better or worse, probably now more time than we've ever had before at home, without all the distractions we otherwise normally would. It's a great time. Just ask yourself, what am I interested in? Let's read about it. Sometimes what am I a little bit less interested in? Let's read a bit about it. And if you then find it interesting, continuing down that road. So that's the first one. I think it's just a great opportunity to do some general reading and making yourself more knowledgeable as a result. The second is just to do more debating, but do it actively, not passively. What I mean by that, it's not simply the idea of going to a tournament, giving 3 to 5 speeches, however many you'll give, depending on the format of the tournament. And then thinking, okay, I've done that, I've gained experience. Fair enough, you probably have gained some experience. But it's so much more if after each of those debates you ask yourself, what did I learn? What would I do differently? And how can I make myself better the next time? Which is, I think, the big difference between a passive way of doing things, which is you're just going to do them and hope you absorb knowledge. That happens. But if it's instead, you do them, hope you absorb knowledge, and ask yourself, well, what could I have done better? I think that makes a huge difference because it's much more targeted. And often you'll find lots of young debaters or debaters of all ages who improve a little bit and keep improving a little bit. There's other individuals who improve really rapidly. And a large part of that is the way in which you're trying to improve. Are you looking actively at ways of improving? Are you looking passively at ways of improving? And the assistance of judges, of coaches, definitely helps along that process, but it isn't all of the process. At least a large part of that is you asking yourself how I would become better. And the third and final part of this is to realize that lots of these skills of debating are things which you can be using in other parts of your everyday life. And sometimes just about noticing that if you're having a conversation with friends, you're arguing, what film do you prefer? What music do you prefer? Who's the best sportsman of all time? Actually, what you're doing there is engaging in an argumentative discussion. not a formal debate, but often the same kinds of skills. And you start picking things up about what people say, how they are saying it. And they're not often, presumably you're not only talking to debaters, they're not thinking in debating mentality. They're just thinking in, here are some ideas I have. Here are ways I'm going to present it. But as you look around all the conversations you have, you'll start seeing more and more of that different people will do slightly different things, but you can pick up a lot from the arguments other individuals will be making in different contexts. Now, the flip side of that is sometimes you'll realize very quickly they are making bad arguments, and they are making arguments badly, particularly if you ever turn on the TV news, you'll get a lot of that. But you'll also see bits where they're using very powerful rhetorical devices, where they're using very useful expressions of words. And what I find useful is once you start noting that, sure, you'll take some of it into your own debating. That's definitely useful. The other part of it, just as general citizens, in fact, is that we start taking bits of it and we become much more critical about what we hear around us. We think about, well, why are they saying what they're saying? Is there an argument behind what they are saying? Or are they simply making a statement with no justification to it to support their personal or political preferences? But I think you get to see all of that, which is look at the debates in the world around you, look at what's effective, and sometimes look at what you think is ineffective. And all of that can help us a huge amount in everyday life, but also in terms of making us much stronger and better as debaters. I've already talked for about 20 minutes, so I think I'm going to stop a monologue at this point and turn it over to all of you.
Thank you, Harish. I think the most satisfying part for me personally was to hear that some of the debaters in the Hong Kong national team had been debating just for a year. So imagine how much more you can achieve if you just put in the passion, the hard work, and the intent. I think that's a great message for the audience. So thank you so much for that. And while you were speaking, Harish, we've had so many arguments flooded in. So what I'm going to do, which is what we had committed to the group, that we are going to make it into an interesting action-based session. So I'm going to hand it over to Kamal and you, where he can sort of take you through a few arguments that have been posted by students, parents across the Hello AugLi channel and on the chat box. But before I go there, I do want to reiterate for the audience that this is a masterclass for the Indian Debating League, which we think is the pyramid and the epitome of debating circuits in India. The fact is that in this August month of Independence Day celebrations, we are making sure that we invite students to come in and participate representing their home, state and union territory teams. So 36 teams are being formed across 28 states and 8 union territories between the grades of 4th to 12th. So you will have 3 categories of 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 12, where you will be debating on the first theme of the Indian Debating League, which is the Sustainable Union Development Goals. So Harish, thank you so much for being a panelist on that. It was going to be an exciting session where you will be joined in by esteemed panels of Brian and Sharmila coming in. But I do want to make sure that the students after the session sort of sign up for it, where they keep continuing and improving their debating journey. So Kamal, with that, I will hand it over to you. If you could just pick out a few arguments where Harish could personally give live feedback on the way the arguments have been structured.
Sure. So, yes,
yeah. Kamal, I think there's a little bit of a connectivity issue. We can't hear you at all. Is it okay if I take it back? I think there's a little bit of a jarringness that is coming in. So we could pick up a few arguments that I can see on the chat, Harish. We've got an argument by Josh Mehta. You are able to see that. I will pick out a few that were personally DM'd to me. So Josh, if you're there on the call, you can read it out, or I'm happy to just repaste it down again for Harish's reference and read this out as well. So Harish, I'm just repasting it on the group so that everybody else sees this as well. This is by Josh. You're able to see it, Harish?
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. So Josh, if you would like to say it, it's good. Otherwise, we just quickly articulate it for the audience. Okay. So now this house believes that India is the best destination for investment, is what Josh believes. He's pro for it. He believes that it's a large country with larger population, but most importantly, it has the largest potential to be the best destination because it's a powerhouse of information technology and engineering sector. Vast amounts of lower middle class and middle class will be getting jobs and working hard, as well as considerable amount of upper middle class and wealthy who are willing to invest in new companies and startups. The average cost of living and investing in a business in India is significantly cheaper than any other Asian country. To sum it up, India is a financial powerhouse and a superpower waiting to be woken up. So that's the first one that we can sort of pick up today, Harish.
Yeah, so I find this to be a very well-made argument. I think lots of the points you raise are very reasonable, that India certainly is both large, but certainly has a very large population, which is very useful when it comes to pushing forward growth, when you note the upper middle class and the wealthy as potential sources of growth. One thing which I would say is there's always this trade-off when it comes to how you make an argument, which is how much detail can you have in each of your points versus how many different claims you are going to be making. And I think what we get here is a very good encapsulation of what the core arguments are for why India could be the best destination for investment. Indeed, I think there's almost all of the core arguments as to why India would be the best destination for investment. What is potentially worth thinking about is in how many words we were given here, which was just over 100, I think. It sometimes can be more effective to go, let's pick one of these arguments and let's just look and talk about it in more detail, which is, let's say it is, India has a huge population. Well, it's not trivial as to how important that is to economic growth and as an investment destination. To step back and just look at it logically, India has certainly had one of the world's largest populations for at least the last 75 years. But arguably, India was not a great destination for foreign investment until the 1980s, almost certainly the 1990s, and certainly not the powerhouse it is today. So it's sometimes worth just picking one of these arguments, explaining them in a lot more detail as to why this really matters and why this is the factor which is most important. I think that can often strengthen the argument. And this is something where we often do have to make the trade-off between how many arguments we make and the detail of each, but sometimes less is more. Sometimes going for a couple of arguments fully explained will have more impact than making 7 or 8 arguments with only partial explanations of them. And I think it's an interesting discussion, but I think there are different approaches to it, both of which can be very valuable depending on the context.
Yeah, Harish, this is very interesting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up a con argument, a completely different side of the coin over here. And I can see so many arguments are coming in. So please excuse me because I'm just picking up the ones that are catching my eye over here, and we'll make sure that you have an opportunity to put yours across. So here is one that I pick up from Deepmala, who's in 11th in summer study hall in Uttarakhand. And she shares her views against the argument that India is termed as the best destination because of low wages, less taxes, and more terms. But if we talk about the Indian economy, the FDI leads to long-term growth of the economy. It is allowing the foreign investors to compress the domestic producers from the market and become only owners. And if we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat, its aim is to make India and its citizens independent, self-reliant. If the foreign investors keep investing in India, do you think India is going to become self-dependent on the future? If we continue to use foreign funds instead of adopting Indian products, do you think India can even be self-reliant? Our only aim is to make the country independent and combating the competition in the global market. And that's how she's putting her argument against the motion that India might not be the best destination for investment, which I have just pasted for your, okay, it's not allowing me to paste. Give me a second. I'm just going to pick it up and paste it also so that you can see it. Otherwise, I'm sure the audience heard it. Okay. Wait, I'm not able to paste it. Just give me 1 second. Harish, I'm just seeing if I can paste it again. Deepmala, are you able to paste it on the group again? Sorry, Harish, were you able to hear it or?
Yeah, so I think I got most of that argument. Okay, so I think actually this is really interesting. And it's curious in two ways, which is, in a sense, that what you're claiming is not even that India isn't the best destination for foreign investment, but whether it would be good for India to get a large amount of foreign investment, given the potential consequences that could have in terms of India not being self-reliant. I think this is one of those really interesting challenges, which is in some ways quite radical, but also quite in vogue. Radical in the fact that it breaks away from what I think we think of the dominant economic consensus of foreign investment being good and necessary to drive growth on the one hand, and then potentially an emerging, if slightly less pronounced issue, which is there are serious drawbacks with foreign direct investment. And what I think you highlight there is the potential of those drawbacks. One thing I would just note on an argumentative level, I think that you very much know you're engaging in this large debate about how important, how good is foreign investment for a country. And I think you provide some of the challenges to it. What I think you need to step back and ask yourself a bit about is, what you're trying to do is prove on balance, is it good or is it bad? Which doesn't mean that there aren't any arguments for foreign investment. I think almost everyone, maybe even the most committed autarkic Marxists, would probably say that there are arguments for foreign investment. The question is, are the arguments for it more important than the arguments against it? And while I think you highlight some of the arguments against foreign investment, for this to be a complete and very powerful argument, you want to look at it a little bit more comparatively, which is just sometimes give a nod that there are positives of foreign investment, but there are certainly big risks as well. And are those risks larger than the potential benefits? Yes, for this reason and this reason, which is sometimes just about elevating the importance of the challenges you make. So I think it's a very good argument. I think to be a complete argument, you want to give a bit more of a nod to the other side, because I think your argument could defeat some of the better arguments for foreign investment. But as stated, it just seems to give one side rather than providing a let's think about both sides and I fall on the con side.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering whether now you are able to see, I think Deepmala posted the argument for us as well, Harish. If you can see that, she's also put that across for us. And I'm just posting another one that is against for the motion, which is by Ananya Raj. And while you all get a chance to read it, she puts her arguments across in terms of saying India is a country with different landforms, which makes it meet the necessary requirements for all types of investments. For example, the mountain regions help us store house many resources, plateaus loaded with many minerals. Second one being, we are the fastest growing economy, special packages by the government, and she names a few. Also with statistics of 65% of the rural people, which majorly face unemployment, investors could easily find employees for an average salary. The fourth reason being India has the largest youth population. It will continue to be even more in the coming years. And it's got the largest group of scientists and investors who can easily find a good amount of skilled technicians here. So that's by Ananya for your view.
Yeah, so I think there's, again, a lot here. And so I think what's quite interesting here is that you have 4 arguments, but I think at least you have 5 in this set, with the hidden one being that India is also one of the world's fastest growing economies, which is certainly an independent reason for it to be an attractive future foreign destination for foreign investment. What I guess I would say is, I think all of these arguments have a lot of power, but maybe there are 2 things I would think about a little bit more, just in terms of how you make this even stronger. The first is what I said before, which is when you're making 4 arguments, one of the consequences is that you're not necessarily fully explaining the importance of any single one of them. Though I think here you have probably a sentence of explanation, which certainly does help. So 65.07% of the population is rural. That very precise statistic there. And the majority of whom face unemployment, which makes it very easy for investors to find employees for an average salary. That certainly has a great amount of truth to it. But I guess there's a couple questions I would ask if I really want to push that, which is, sure, you have a very large rural population, and therefore potentially, along with your 5th argument, potentially a very large workforce. But that's a little bit more theoretical than it is practical. If I'm to set up a company on the outskirts of Mumbai, or in Chennai, or in Bangalore, how useful is it for me that 65.07% of the rural population is that amount of the population is rural, unless we believe they're going to largely be migrating? So I think in a sense, the argument's very much there, because what you're saying is India's a very large population, many people are unemployed, they aren't necessarily getting great wages now, and that's potentially a very strong market, a very strong labor market, added to, I guess, argument 4, which speaks in a little bit of a different direction, often a very well-educated labor market. But if you're a foreign investor, you're not looking at the entire size of the labor market, because you're not going to be able to employ a rural worker in Assam if I'm a company in Chennai. So I think it's often just thinking a tiny bit beyond that, which is not look beyond the headline figures. Because I think the strongest argument and what you're claiming here is actually greater than that. It is with a rural population, what we're seeing in India, and mainly across the developing world, is large amounts of rural to urban migration, where you have a very, sometimes young, but often very motivated workforce, which is growing year by year in urban centers. So it's not about the total population of rural areas, but probably the stronger claim is the speed of migration from rural areas to urban areas. And that is what really gives sustenance potentially to foreign investors. Just to look at one of those arguments, and how I think if you look at it in more detail, there's much more to potentially say, and how valuable that potentially is for the future of India.
Yeah. And Harish, it's amazing how many more entries are coming in. But because we've taken a few arguments which we can make out the students who are of a higher grade, I'm going to unmute Ojasya Garg. If you're okay, Ojasya, we can see you. For you to tell us about your argument. So I'm asking you to unmute.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. I'm from Mayo College, Ajmer, and I am not very experienced with debating as of now, because I'm only in the 8th grade, and since the end of grade 6, we've been at home. So we haven't been given many opportunities from the school to represent ourselves or represent our school. So the argument I wanted to present to you was regarding I'm speaking against the motion of the House, which states that India is the best destination for foreign investment. I oppose the motion of the House because the GDP, the stock market, foreign investments, every single thing from the lowest share to the highest share is going down. That is because of the coronavirus that's struck from the past year, and that's wreaked havoc all across the world. But I had also given an example, like if you take Tata Motors, for example, when there is a festive season where people are looking to buy new vehicles, to buy new appliances, I'd say. So they reduce their prices so that more people buy. But eventually what happens, the Indians, and like a few of them are very stingy. Not all of them are like they're looking to spend a lot. That's known all over the world about Indians. Not I don't want to raise controversies over this, but like the companies do reduce their prices and then hike them again once the festive seasons are over, because they know that people aren't going to buy cars anymore. The prices have dropped off, like from a box of paper to big machines which are being sold. So I am not very tech savvy with the stock market at the moment, even though my maternal uncle is an investor, so he keeps talking to me regarding that. I did not know the exact name of the highest share today, but the high, if you compare it to US's Dow Jones Industry, there is a huge difference, because Dow Jones Industries has been on a rise for like about more than 2 months. I haven't checked it as recently, but like
So just here, your buzzer goes now. So along with your arguments, you've also given the reflection of capturing an argument. So we give it back to Harish sir to give you feedback. Is that okay? Thank you, Jasya.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is very interesting. And certainly I think that there's 2 points in what you're raising. The first is, if you look over the last 18 months, the Indian economy in particular has been struggling. I think you rightly note a large part of that is because of COVID-19. And even when compared with the United States, India certainly had a much worse second wave than almost any other country in the world, but certainly worse than the United States, albeit I think if you look at current US COVID statistics, that's no longer particularly positive either. But I think that's certainly true, that if you're comparing India with many other economies, it had a very bad 2020 economically, and 2021 will only ever point to a slight recovery, in part because of what we saw with the second wave. Now, one question which I have is, all of that may be true, but is that a long-term or was that a short-term issue? And the answer could be either. Could it be that India, for whatever reason, was particularly vulnerable to COVID and the economic implication? There's certainly some truth in that. Could it also, though, be that the structure of the Indian economy has several potential flaws, which COVID is adding to, but not actually the only cause of? And certainly there's evidence of that as well. If you go back to 2019, the Indian economy has been slowing, sometimes quite dramatically, for several years. So maybe there's something underlying which goes beyond COVID, which explains India's weaker performance than you otherwise would expect. I guess from an argumentative perspective, and this isn't, the question is, what is that? And there are hundreds of potential explanations. But in some ways, that's the big challenge, which is, it's true the Indian economy hasn't been performing well. Well, and has been performing well for probably about 4 years now. Even if you exclude the COVID-19 pandemic, well, what is explaining it? And I think what your argument does very well is highlights that reality. What I think we all need to work out, and I say this as an economist as well, what is driving the relatively weaker performance of the Indian economy from what we otherwise would expect for a country, as other people pointed out, with a very large population, with a very well-educated population, with potentially huge natural resource growth. And that, I think, is in some ways the underlying question of what is going to happen to India in the next 20 years.
Harish, I think this is a great perspective that we've got from you, and I'm just conscious of the time check. I can see so many more questions coming in. I'll encourage all of you to definitely drop us a line so that we organize a sub-session, or we make sure that we have this answered. But having said that, I think one of the great opportunities that we are making sure, Harish, when we get children to come, interact with you, participate, is to represent their state teams, is to stand up for the sustainable development goals that they believe in. So I'm just quickly going to ping the link of the, Indian Debating League so that you all are able to look it up. Because the fact is that's where it becomes real. I mean, the good part is to attend a masterclass to get over the theory. The better part is to be able to practice it, because like we say, practice doesn't make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. Okay, so with that, I would love it, if you all come and participate and meet and get a chance to meet Harish sir again, and make sure that you are utilizing this day as a good reflection of thanking our founding fathers for the independence that we all enjoy, but more importantly, participate in shaping the nation that we have together. So with that, a warm welcome and a warm good evening, good afternoon to you, Harish, and a happy Independence Day once again. Thank you so much. Harish, any words that you want to share as we part? Really happy to.
Well, it was my pleasure. Hope all of you continue debating, and certainly join the Indian Debating League. It'd be a great opportunity to either continue or start your debating journey. A great way to learn more, to challenge yourself, and potentially to improve all the skills, which I think are vital in life, but shine through when you do debating.
Lovely. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening and day ahead. Bye-bye.